Good afternoon, and you're very welcome to this second session, Willkommen. This session will look at church cantatas after Bach. Our four contributors will focus on composers, so we're going to begin with Stephen A. Christ on Krebs, Andrew Frampton will look at Agricola, Gregor Richter on Benda, and Magdalena Auenmüller on Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach. I hope you enjoy the sessions. We've decided to have questions at the end of all four speakers, and then we'll open up questions also to the audience. So let's start with Stephen on Krebs. Thank you.
My remarks today come on the heels of finishing a scholarly edition of the complete vocal music of Johann Ludwig Krebs, one of Bach's most prominent students. It currently is in production for the recent researches in the Music of the Baroque Era series of AR editions, and I expect it will be published sometime next year. Compared to Johann Sebastian Bach, Krebs's output of vocal music was relatively modest. On the bottom half of this slide, you can see that 5 liturgical pieces with Latin texts have been preserved: a Missa Brevis, 3 settings of the Sanctus, and a Magnificat. There is also a German Magnificat and an a cappella motet, Erforsche mich Gott und erfahre mein Herz. The last item on the list is a so-called oratorio funebre, which doesn't resemble an oratorio at all, but is actually a drama per musica along the lines of Bach's cantatas for the birthdays of Saxon royalty. It was composed to mark the passing of Maria Józefa, Queen of Poland, who died in November 1757, and its libretto is in Italian. Given the theme of this year's Bach Festival, however, I'm going to focus on the pieces at the top of the slide, a group of German cantatas in the mold of those by Krebs's teacher, J.S. Bach. The list includes 2 chorale cantatas, the 4th item, Jesu meine Freude, and the last one, Herzlich tut mich verlangen. They invite comparison with Bach's extensive cycle of 66 chorale cantatas, most of which were composed 300 years ago in the year 1724 to 1725, and all of which have been performed here this week by choirs from around the world. The opening movement of Krebs's Cantata 109 includes 1 stanza of a hymn set in 4-part harmony with the melody in the soprano. Interpolated between each sentence of the hymn text are 2 lines of poetic commentary sung by the alto in recitative style. The words of the hymn are indicated here in bold type, and the words of the recitative in regular type. Essentially, the same procedure is found in some of Bach's cantatas, for instance, the 7th movement of Cantata 92, except that the recitative passages aren't assigned to a single voice. Rather, they're sung by each of the 4 voices in turn, first by the bass, then the tenor, alto, and soprano. Bach's chorale cantatas are typically based on a single hymn. The first and last stanzas are set in the first and last movements of the cantata. The texts of the cantata's inner movements, usually a series of recitatives and arias, are poetic paraphrases of the remaining stanzas of the hymn. Krebs's chorale cantatas are more eclectic than Bach's. In the middle column of this slide, you can see that the first and last movements of Krebs's Cantata 109 come from 2 different hymns, and the recitatives in movements 1 and 3 aren't based on either one of them. Rather, they were taken from Erdmann Neumeister's Fünffache Kirchenandachten, a huge collection of cantata texts published here in Leipzig in 1716. Another important difference is that Krebs's cantatas generally are shorter than Bach's. This one has only 2 inner movements, an aria and a recitative. Bach's chorale cantatas usually have a minimum of 2 each for a total of at least 6 movements. And this is just one example of the very many ways in which Krebs's cantatas shed light on Bach's and vice versa. My edition is based on about 30 manuscript sources, including 8 autographs, as well as scores and performing parts in the hands of many different copyists. Quite a few of them are in major libraries in Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, London, and Brussels. But some are in more out-of-the-way places, such as church archives in the towns of Stade and Luckau. The edition includes an extensive critical report and introduction with many details about the transmission of Krebs's vocal music. For instance, the only sources for Cantata 109 are a score and a set of performing parts in the Kantorei Bibliothek in Luckau. They're in the hand of Christian August Krieg, who served as cantor, first at the Nikolaikirche in Luckau, and later at the Dreikönigskirche in Dresden. Here's a photograph of the wrapper and the first page of the score. After more than a decade as a student in Leipzig, Krebs took up his first professional position in the spring of 1737 as organist at St. Mary's in Zwickau. And there he composed the first cantata that has come down to us, and the only one that's preserved in his own handwriting, the first item on the slide. Krebs also composed a cantata in his next position as castle organist in Zeitz. The evidence for this compositional activity is in an unusual location, the steeple of the Friedenskirche in Radebeul, a suburb just a few miles northwest of Dresden. In the course of renovations in 1746, a handwritten libretto for the cantata Ertönt willkommene Andachtslieder was deposited in the church tower, and it survives. The occasion for the cantata was a celebration of peace that took place in the year 1746. Unfortunately, the music hasn't been preserved, but against all odds, I was able to obtain photographs of the libretto. In 2018, the steeple was renovated for the first time in nearly 60 years. The metal box containing documents from the renovation in 1746 was temporarily removed. The woman on the right in this photograph, Christina Nierkorn-Steger, happened to have taken a few photos with her cell phone, and she was kind enough to make them available to me. They included the libretto for Krebs's Cantata 107 on the right-hand side, the first two movements, aria and recitative, aria tutti, and then the second page. So I'm very pleased to have that as well, even though there's no music. The cantatas of J.S. Bach's favorite student, Johann Ludwig Krebs, are of obvious historical interest, contributing to our knowledge of the compositional output of the next generation of church musicians in Bach's orbit. The music has many lovely features, even if one has to overlook the sometimes excessive diatonicism. Krebs can be said to have written very competent music in the style prevalent in central Germany in the generation after his famous teacher. For this reason, even if Krebs is likely, in fact inevitably, going to remain permanently in the shadow of Bach, it seems clear that his vocal music is well worth recovering and knowing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We're going to move on to Andrew now. Thank you.
A crucial event in the development of sacred music in Berlin in the middle of the 18th century occurred in January 1755, and this was when Rudolf Dietrich Buchholz was appointed as cantor of the Petrikirche, one of the oldest and most important Protestant churches in the city. Press reports from the Berlinische Nachrichten newspaper give detailed information on the cantata repertoire performed in the church at this time, and they reveal that there was an active cooperation in the provision of sacred music for the church between Buchholz and composers working for the Berlin court, especially the Kapellmeister Karl Heinrich Braun and the former Bach pupil Johann Friedrich Agricola. So, as a case study of the Lutheran church cantata after J.S. Bach's death, Berlin is particularly interesting because its expression of Enlightenment culture was heavily influenced by the skepticism of Friedrich II towards religion. And unlike many of their contemporaries elsewhere, such as Gottfried Homilius, Agricola and his court colleagues tended only to produce sacred music for high feast days or special events because their compositional priorities were not liturgical. Nonetheless, Agricola's legacy as a church composer represents the most intact corpus of his musical materials for his own works that we have. So it's of particular significance. Under his teacher J.S. Bach, Agricola would certainly have been exposed to the weekly ritual of cantata performances in the Leipzig churches, and as his Lebenslauf suggests, he might even have played organ in some of them. And a letter from Agricola to Telemann refers to the fact that he'd been experimenting with composing in the church style since at least 1752. But 1755 seems to have been a crucial year for his engagement with sacred music. Not only did it see the appointment of Buchholz as cantor, but also the first performance of Graun's hugely popular passion cantata, Der Tod Jesu, in which Agricola sang the tenor solos. So it was in the wake of this success that he began writing music for the Petrikirche. Previous scholarship has underestimated the breadth and quality of his output of church music. Most catalogue listings give only between 10 to 12 compositions. The true number is around twice that, and there are probably more that haven't been identified or no longer exist. And there are also 8 pieces of doubtful authenticity that you can't see on the screen there. Music for the major feasts of the church year unsurprisingly dominates, but there are also several occasional works, including this funeral cantata, Valete Seelen voll Schwermut. This was written as a commemorative mourning ode for Frederick II's mother, Queen Sophia Dorothea, who died in June 1757. Its opening movement, interestingly, seems to consciously draw some inspiration from the chorus O Mensch bewein from Bach's St. Matthew Passion. But in this piece, we do see many core features of Agricola's church style, including homophonic choral textures against a polyphonic instrumental background in the opening movement, frequent alteration between tutti and solo parts, an extended choral fugue towards the end of the work, and one or more long soprano arias, in this case 2, featuring long melismas and coloratura. Agricola was married to one of the court's star operatic sopranos, Benedetta, and these arias were clearly intended as vehicles for her. Many of his cantatas also contain elaborate writing for obbligato organ. In this funeral work, as in many of his cantatas, chorales also play an important structural and expressive role. The libretto falls into 2 parts of 4 movements each, both concluding with a chorale, and Agricola chooses to conclude the first part of this cantata, which deals exclusively with mourning and melancholy, with the chorale Es ist genug, to the text Den heißen Gram, which was of course set by J.S. Bach in O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, BWV 60. This is surely symbolic on multiple levels. The chorale's famous tritone interval and its eventual resolution at the final cadence may be seen as both representing the transition from extreme pain into something more consolatory, so from the first to the second part of the cantata, and the crossing over of the soul into the afterlife. This idea of transition from grief to comfort is expanded upon, both textually and musically, in the following recitative that opens the second part, which is a prayer that reflects on the notion of tears of pain becoming tears of joy. One of the reasons Agricola's sacred music has been neglected by scholarship is that many of the relevant materials have only recently become available through the rediscovery of the Berlin Singakademie collection, and this contains more of his cantata autographs than any other collection, and indeed sources for works that exist nowhere else. In most cases, the autographs have been carefully preserved alongside the original performing materials, so this allows us to study the interaction between the composer and his copyists. For example, in the sources for this 1758 Easter Day cantata, Die Auferstehung des Erlösers, we find this striking change in the solo soprano part of the recitative text from Erhabener Held, also found in the autograph, to Erstadener Held. Crucially, the change is in Agricola's hand, and this also means he must have sanctioned other textual differences in this part not found in the autograph, such as the reassignment of the solo tenor aria to the soprano. But in another recitative, the parts show an alternative version of bar 14 to the autograph, and here the autograph clearly shows some evidence of erasures, which suggests it's been subject to revision, and by matching the placement of the erasures to the readings in the parts, we can actually see that there's a kind of continuous dialogue between the autograph and the parts, between Agricola and his copyists, constantly revising and reshaping this work over one or perhaps more likely several performances. There are many musical highlights in this beautiful cantata, but the real jewel is this soprano aria. It's a long, virtuosic movement grounded in an operatic gallant style that marks a return to the full festive orchestration of the opening chorus. There are pairs of trumpets and horns in solo tutti dialogue with each other, and the rest of the orchestra is itself in dialogue with the soprano. All the hallmarks of Agricola's coloratura soprano writing are on full display here. There are acrobatic triplets and arpeggios, often soaring to quite great heights. And the deployment of these musical features is all the more appropriate given the subject of the text, which asks the angels to lend their songs of splendor. And the operatic quality of the vocal writing is also evidenced from several pauses that are written into the music, most notably this one at the word Engel, which has this kind of brief but magical moment that provides the soprano with the opportunity for elaborate embellishments, and also word paints the image of an angel descending to earth. So there's a real kind of radiant, festive quality to this aria that provides a fitting climax to the work before the final chorale. Also located in the Singakademie collection is a set of parts for another Easter cantata, which had previously been unknown, and I located the autograph of this cantata in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, so it's been quite interesting to see the transmission of some of these works beyond Berlin. Finally, I just wanted to mention the 1759 festive cantata Der König jauchzt von dir entzückt, which is the only cantata to have appeared in print in Agricola's lifetime, and it was widely disseminated. It's a free poetic translation of Psalm 21, and it was written for a Thanksgiving service celebrating the Prussian army's victory at the Battle of Zorndorf in August 1758. This context explains the impetus behind the printing of the work, the very lavish festive scoring, 3 trumpets, timpani and 2 horns, and also the choice of text, which speaks of the victories of King David over his enemies. However, not only was this work distributed in multiple printed and manuscript copies, but it seems to have given rise to a number of parody compositions. The Ratzeburg Domarchiv holds 2 late 18th century sources that transmit scores and parts for 2 cantatas attributed to Agricola, Der Gottmensch jauchzt and Nisagt ein Christi. In fact, though, these constitute the first and second halves of Der König jauchzt, but with added recitatives and chorales and 1 additional aria. The evidence suggests that it's most likely that these are parodies of the Zorndorf cantata rather than the other way around, and although there are strong arguments against their authenticity, we can't be certain that they're not Agricola's own work. 2 further works attributed to Agricola from 1768, a Dixit Dominus and a Magnificat setting, are likewise based on Der König jauchzt, but the significant extent of the restructuring and repurposing of the musical material makes them much more likely to be parodies by another composer. And 1 further and unusual parody is also known from an 18th century manuscript held in Denmark, in which part of the cantata has been copied and translated into Danish. So that was a very quick tour through some of these sources, but they're all testament to the fact that Agricola's sacred music was widely known in Berlin, but also extended beyond the confines of the city. Indeed, his cantatas are significant as representative examples of the post-Bach Lutheran cantata at a crucial transitional moment. The stylistic hybridity and the musical and poetic features observed in these works demand further study in order to understand the complexities of how this transition occurred and its relationship to further changes in the genre of Lutheran music that occurred later in the century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. So Gregor will speak to us now about Benda.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. While today Georg Anton Benda is known first and foremost for his melodramas and his Singspiele, for which even the young Mozart admired him, he was equally valued by his contemporaries as a thorough church composer. The Württemberg poet and composer Christian Friedrich Daniel Schubert, for example, not only counted Benda among the epoch-making figures of his time, but particularly highlighted his services to Protestant church music. And I quote Schubert, he wrote about Benda, even in his sacred pieces, this great man has distinguished himself. We possess a few church cycles by him, which prove to all of Germany how strong Benda was in sacred pathos. Wherever there is sacred music in our fatherland, there his cantatas were also performed. Even in the smallest musical cities, also in villages, where one only knows music to some extent, Benda is known. Immediately after becoming Kapellmeister at the Gotha court in 1750, following the death of Gottfried Heinrich Stölzle, a position for which the Bach pupil Agricola also applied. Benda set the cantata cycle Das Namenbuch Christi und der Christen by Benjamin Schmoik to music for the church year 1750-1751. But unfortunately, no musical sources have survived for this first cycle. For the time being, the only evidence that we have is the surviving print that you see here. But, however, it can be assumed that the compositions of the Schmoik cycle were Benda's first attempt at writing church cantatas. Compositions from his time at the Prussian court, where he served as a musician in the Hofkapelle of Frederick the Great, starting in 1742, have not yet become known. Probably because he was not entirely satisfied with his early cantatas produced in Gotha, Benda later was not interested in further distributing the Schmoik cycle, as can be seen from a statement that indirectly goes back to Benda. And I quote, "Our Kapelldirektor has produced no more than 3 complete cantata cycles, none of which is printed, but they are, as he says, only communicated by him. He leaves them for copying on request, but only the 2nd or the 3rd cycle, because he himself is not completely satisfied with his first one." And only slightly better is the source situation for Benda's 2nd cantata cycle on text by the poet Johann Jakob Rambach, which was performed in Gotha 1753 and 1754. In addition to this libretto of the performance, 11 cantatas or fragments of cantatas have survived. And some of these pieces point to Stölzle as a model. For example, the use of extended choral fugues in the opening dictum movements, which can also be found in Stölzle cantatas. And it would not be surprising if Benda had modeled his work on that of his predecessor. Stölzle left a significant number of cantatas behind when he died, and which Benda performed several times during his time in Gotha, and which Benda, who was inexperienced in the field of church music, could have used as a reference. Unlike Benda's first 2 cantata cycles, the music for his third texts, his first cycle on text by Balthasar Münter, can fortunately be completely reconstructed, thanks to its widespread distribution in the second half of the 18th century. And no less than 400 musical manuscripts can be found in over a dozen archives and libraries across Europe. So when Schubert, you saw the opening quote, speaks of the smallest and musical cities and villages in which Benda's church music was performed, he probably meant the Münter cycle by Benda. Yeah, Balthasar Münter wrote a so-called ideal cycle for the church year of 1760-1761 with 72 cantata texts for our Sundays and feast days of the liturgical calendar. And the cycle, therefore, was not tied to a specific church year, but could also be used in any other year. And for this reason, Münter's text became also attractive to other composers, including a member of the Krebs family, Johann Gottfried Krebs from Altenburg, who set the cycle into music. Yeah, so let me summarize real quick. In 1750, the year of Johann Sebastian Bach's death, Benda began composing church cantatas. As I have tried to show, this part of Benda's oeuvre is, on the one hand, characterized by great loss, and on the other by a great abundance of sources. But It is this very contrast that makes Benda an interesting object to study the development of the church cantata after Bach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregor. Our final speaker for this session is Magdalena, and Magdalena will look at Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach.
Thank you for having me. Today I want to talk about the cantatas by Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach, its source situation and the musical features. Only 2 church cantatas and 8 secular cantatas can be attributed to Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach with certainty. The 2 church cantatas, both funeral cantatas, and 3 of the 8 secular cantatas were probably commissioned during Bach's work in Minden. These are settings of texts by the Minden poet Sophie Friederike Martini. Of these works, only the musical score for the festive cantata Westfalen's Freude has survived. The music was performed in Minden on the occasion of the visit of King Friedrich Wilhelm II on June 5th in 1788. The performance led the monarch to appoint Bach to the Prussian court in Berlin. From 1789 he worked there as a chamber harpsichordist, Kapellmeister and music teacher, first to Queen Friederike Luise of Prussia and since 1797 to Queen Louise of Prussia. Among Bach's cantatas, it is the only work that can be proven to have appeared in print, even if only in the form of a piano reduction. This achieved national fame. There are 3 arrangements by other composers. In all arrangements, the sequence of movements given in the piano reduction was largely adopted. Bach himself stated in a letter that also his cantata Columbus oder die Entdeckung von Amerika was published in print. However, there is no evidence of this. It could also have been a piano reduction, which is now lost. At court in Berlin, Bach hardly seems to have been entrusted with commissions for cantata compositions. This is only likely in the case of his Le Bouquet de la Famille Royale. The work was performed on the birthday of Queen Friederike Luise of Prussia on October 16th in 1789. His farce Concerto Buffo, which was composed at the court too, has cantata-like features. Due to its small scale and form, it should be seen more as an educational work to introduce instrument and could have been made for and with the royal children. The instrumental line-up that may have been available to Bach at court does not appear to have been extensive, so that the performance of large-scale orchestral, vocal and stage works was not possible. Particularly in the first years of his time in Berlin, Bach was obviously looking for performance opportunities outside the court. For example, in 1791 he re-performed his cantata Colmar in a concert of the Musikliebhaber in Berlin. It had its first performance in Minden in 1785. Around the turn of the century, Bach got into financial emergency, which resulted from cuts in the ensemble's budget and was worsened by the suspension of his employment during the War of the Fourth Coalition in 1806-07. He tried to publish short piano pieces and piano songs in music periodicals and focused on compositions for practical use. With the death of Queen Louise on July 19th in 1810, Bach's period of service finally ended. He receded into the background and shifted his musical activities to the Grand National Mother Lodge. At least 2 of his cantatas were performed in the lodge's concerts. The Kantate zur Stiftungsfeier der Großen Nationalmutterloge zu den 3 Weltkugeln in September 1806 and the Cantata Columbus oder die Entdeckung von Amerika in October 1810. In summary, only the musical sources for the cantatas Westfalen's Freude and Columbus have been preserved, along with the Concerto Buffo. The partition into arias, recitatives and choral movements was abandoned by Bach in favor of a colorfully orchestrated, through-composed form that highlights the dramatic events. Changes in time, tempo, key, and instrumentation take place in a small space. In this, Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach is based on the typical development of secular cantatas in Germany in the later 18th century. Incidentally, the secular cantatas of his father Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach represent the high point of this development. It is characterized by rich instrumentation, sensitive cantabile melodics, and, in particular, by the free formation with numerous interludes and movement transitions. Recitatives and arias were no longer rigidly imposed. The composers oriented themselves towards the underlying textual poems. The dramatic and musical interpretation of a ballad text by Luise Brachmann becomes particularly clear in Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach's cantata Columbus. The event becomes virtually audible. We hear an excerpt shortly before the end of the work. The sailors finally turn against their Captain Columbus because there is no land in sight and they feel lost. The angry mood of the pack combines with the roar of the sea until the coast finally appears in front of them and brings salvation. Thank you for your attention.
What a way to finish. Thank you, Magdalena. We'll open the discussion to the panelists first. Any comments or questions, Stephen?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to all of my co-panelists here, and it's great to go out on such a high note. It was wonderful. My question actually is for Andrew. Just a factual question about the availability of the Agricola cantatas. And particularly I was interested in the funeral music from 1757, but also to some extent the cantata written for the peace treaty. And the reason I would be interested anyway, but 1757 was a tough year for queens. That's the year that I mentioned very briefly. Maria Josefa died. And I think it's very interesting, even though I wasn't talking about the Oratorio Funebre, that now I know that two in the Bach circle were writing funeral music for queens. Agricola earlier in the year and Krebs later in the year. And then the cantata for the peace, well, the text that I was able to get, for which there's no music, is also written for a piece about 15 years earlier. So there's probably less to compare there in terms of music versus just the text. But I'm just wondering what the availability is, because I would love to look and see what the commonalities are or differences.
Yeah, I agree, and some of those parallels are very interesting. The peace cantata is not, as far as I'm aware, available in a modern critical edition. That print is available if you go onto RISM.
Yep.
Yeah, you can find the copy of that print. It's very nicely done. But as I kind of alluded to, there's a kind of complicated transmission history and possible revisions to the work, and some of those manuscripts are not easily available for consultation. So more work needs to be done there. In terms of the funeral music, I have done an edition of that as part of my doctoral thesis. Something that made it quite... the sources are very nice to work with because they're very beautifully preserved carefully preserved. There's the text booklet, there's the original performing parts, or some of the original performing parts, and the autograph. Unfortunately, what I think is probably a single leaf from the autograph is missing, which is the opening to the final chorus before the concluding chorale, and that can't be reconstructed. So there is a kind of incomplete status to it that we just don't know what the music sounded like for the opening of that final movement. But nonetheless, I think it's a wonderful piece and deserves to be performed and studied more widely, particularly in the context of some of the things that you were talking about.
Thank you.
I had a question for Magdalena, actually. Sorry. I noticed that there were some scores in the British Library,
Yes.
and I wondered if you could speak more about why those scores, or how they ended up in London,
Yeah.
if this is a particular kind of pattern of transmission with his works, or it's just kind of coincidence.
Yeah, the most of his works, of Wilhelm Friedrich Bach's works, were in his family's possession in a long time in autograph form. He nearly published no works at all. And later they were auctioned off to a Berlin library and to Carly Zöller. It was a collector of music and a viola player. And he went to London to the British Library and auctioned it, sold it there. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. So we'll open it to the audience now. Any questions from the floor?
Bernd Koska. And I just have a practical question to Stephen. Are there any recordings of the Krebs cantatas, or is it planned to have some?
There is one recording. It was made by Michael Schönheit, and with the Concerto Vocale Leipzig and Merseburger Hofmusik, done in 2013 on the occasion of Krebs's 300th birthday. That's it. It's a very serviceable recording. I'm glad to have it. There are quibbles as I've done the edition, and I don't actually know what they used for the recording. They must have obviously have scored it up to be able to record. But so I can recommend that certainly. And there are a few other individual pieces. The motet has been recorded a couple of times. Yeah.
I hope there will be more recordings following your editions. I really would like to hear these pieces.
I certainly hope so too. There certainly has been interest. When I was at the University of Cambridge in the autumn, one of the choral conductors there was very interested, and unfortunately the time constraints didn't allow it, but it certainly got his attention. And while I mention it, I just thought of this as well. There's a team of editors, 2 editors, who are putting together a life and works of Krebs in English. And they've just recently been in touch and asked me to contribute a chapter about the vocal works. And then I also have, in addition to the edition, an article coming out specifically on the cantatas that will be in the Bach Journal this September. So a little bit of activity around Krebs.
Thank you so much. We have another question here.
Name is still John Butt. I'm the very proud possessor of the entire choral works of C.P. Bach in hard copy. They're absolutely wonderful new edition. And what strikes me about that whole corpus is the huge amount of parody in it, parody of other composers' works. And there seems to be very little of this in the people that you've been looking at today. Is C.P. Bach the odd one out in this respect, as a parodist, as it were, or have you found evidence of other composers doing this sort of thing?
None whatsoever in the few Krebs works. Benda?
It's not the case for Benda.
Real Benda, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Benda was used by C.P. Bach.
Right.
So, I mean, you name it. They're all a huge amount of Telemann.
They exchanged music between Gotha and Hamburg.
with Agricola, to a very limited extent, probably better to say that there's parody within certain works, or strong inspiration drawn from other composers' works. There are some allusions to Bach, as I said, also Zelenka and a few other composers, but no complete parody works. No.
Wilhelm Friedrich Ernst Bach only arranged some works by his father, Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach, Die Kindheit Jesu, not of his uncle. No.
Thank you very much. Well, it's time to bring this session to a close. Thank you so much for all of your contributions, wonderful and stimulating. And it does mean that we do have time, maybe during the 10-minute crossover, for further discussions and questions. Thank you very much.